Hey guys, so this video is going to talk briefly about the Edward Field poem Icarus that you had a chance to recently write. So when we look at our prompt here, of course, it mentions the allusion to the Greek myth of Daedalus and Icarus. It even gives you a footnote at the bottom here that gives you a little bit of information. The idea being, if you know the legend of Icarus, the myth, you are going to be at an advantage. But if you don't, they're going to give you just enough information that you can make sense of this piece. So what we are supposed to do as we look at this is to think about how the Icarus myth is adapted to a contemporary setting. And Field is absolutely using an allusion to Icarus. I mentioned this in the other video about Siren Song, that when an author uses a mythical allusion, generally the purpose there is not just narrative. They're trying to make a bridge or a connection into a deeper metaphorical meaning. So when you see a reference to a mythical or, legendary allusion, you need to be thinking about how does that allusion, how does that story transcend the narrative and give me some kind of lesson or something to think about in terms of humanity, right? So Icarus, the story of Icarus is he flies too close to the sun and he dies. And it's awful. It's heartbreaking. And Daedalus warns him and it still happens. And blah, blah, blah. The idea being that we have to be mindful of our own limits and we have to be thoughtful when it comes to pride and glory. And we need to aim high, but not too high. Okay, so there's all these different possible, lessons that we learn from the Icarus myth. Looking through, these are some of my annotations from it. And when I read this poem, I think about the universality of myth, right? That it doesn't matter where you are or what your background is, this myth can teach you something. Again, so when you see a mythic allusion, there is this idea of learning. My watch wants me to stand up. I think about the ancient warning of being cautious, but then Field kind of inverts that, right? So when Icarus falls and he lands in the water, he doesn't drown, but in fact, he swims away, okay? And he swims into this modern world and he becomes Mr. Hicks. But Mr. Hicks goes kind of the other way, right? He's not adventurous and he's very careful and he's very cautious. He rents the house and he tends the garden. Everybody calls him nice. So there's this idea that he kind of goes the other way. So I think about, for me, my metaphorical interpretation here is about you have to be both. You have to be brave and adventurous and try new things and aim for the stars, but you also have to be cautious and careful. You got to be a little bit of both. So finding a balance, finding a way, finding a time to be those things. As I look through the poem, there, some of the language I circle here, some of these red things I've circled, starting with the word only, I think is significant, especially, that's our first word here, and then our last word is drowned. The only implies a singular story, a singular narrative, a singular option, and that's not the case here, right? The myth of Icarus is what we've always heard is that he drowns. Field is presenting another idea here, but then he comes back to that word, drowned. So while Icarus in this story becomes Mr. Hicks and doesn't physically drown, he drowns in another way. He drowns in this suburbia. He drowns in this boredom. He drowns in this monotony. So the idea being that the only narrative may have another story, but the outcome kind of the same. I circled other words here like spectacular. There's nothing really spectacular about Icarus or Mr. Hicks now. When we look at the language of the second stanza here, words like concealed, controlled, defeated, compelled, middling, merely. Mr. Hicks isn't special. He's not Icarus. He's not this brave, incredible, mythic being. He's just a neighbor. He's just an everyday person, in his gray suit and his hat in the suburbs. He wants to be the hero that he once was, but he can't, right? He can't go back to what he was. So the third stanza, we have this inversion or change. The Mr. Hicks, who seems so nice in stanza 2, really is actually hurtful and dealing with a lot of trauma, a lot of pain. And I would say, I would go as far as say a bit sadistic, that he works in his workshop. He is constructing these wings. He's trying to fly into the lighting fixture, the ceiling, knowing that he's going to fail every single time. Okay, and the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. That Mr. Hicks is willing to hurt himself over and over and over for a shot at glory. But it is a very limited, landscape here. He's in his workshop. He's going up to the lighting fixture, just the ceiling, not the sky. So where Icarus once aimed for the sky and he runs into the sun, Mr. Hicks just runs into the ceiling. He runs into the lighting fixture. And again, the idea being about balance. You don't want to go all the way to the sun, but you don't want to be limited by the ceiling either. You've got to figure out where to go. I think it's interesting to note that repetition of the sky and the sun on a smaller scale. Okay, so where Icarus's landscape was this, firmament above him, this enormous world above him, Mr. Hicks has severely limited himself, right? And being overly cautious can do that. Being overly scared can do that. If we tend to limit ourselves, we tend to box ourselves in. Contrast back to the original wing there, his small wings. Everything Mr. Hicks does is on a much smaller scale because he's timid and he's frightened and he doesn't have that same identity that he had once before. And I think the message being here that there are times, at least this is for me, a metaphorical interpretation I would make, that there are times when we reach too far and we overextend and we get hurt and we get scared, right? And we may be unwilling to make that same extension. And sometimes we're afraid then to make any extensions. But we can't do that, y'all. We can't fail once and then refuse to try ever again. We can't fail once and then only make the most minute attempts to be better. We're going to fail. That's the human condition, guys. We fail. Okay, we fail. We're not failures, though. Okay, we fail at certain things, but you can fail at certain things and still be successful, and still be happy, and still be well-rounded, and still be dynamic and powerful and brave, and all of those things we want to be. All of those things that made Icarus esteemable and respected, we can still be those things without being thoughtless, without being overly dangerous. And Mr. Hicks seems to miss that, right? He wants to be the hero, but he doesn't know how to break past that fear. I do think it's important to note that the juxtaposition of this language, and I said that here on the side here, mirrors the juxtaposition of the tale, right? And the position of the old and the modern, the drowned and the alive, the happy and the sad, the brave and the coward, pride and reservation, hero and the everyday. Everything in this poem is about like contrast. It's about juxtaposition. It's about like this duplicate nature, where Icarus is one thing, Mr. Hicks is the other, and they are absolutely extremes. I think noticing that, you got to tie that into meaning. You've got to tie that into, a deeper metaphorical understanding. And there's a lot of ways you can take this. It can be about pride. It could be about ego. It could be about adventure. It could be about learning from mistakes. I mean, y'all, there's so many metaphorical meanings or lessons here. I wouldn't say this piece is necessarily didactic in that it's teaching a moral lesson, but there is the idea that we are to learn from it and learn from Icarus. Ipso facto, kind of learn from ourselves, right? That we are always learning and developing. Looking at the poem, I do think it's interesting to note there are 2 longer stanzas, right? These tell the narrative, and then 2 shorter stanzas. These tell the outcome. So we have the narrative, we have the actual events, and then we have the results, or I'm searching for a word here because my brain at the end of the day is like a little bit fried. I either need more coffee or less. I think more at this point. The narrative of these two stanzas here, then kind of followed up by the lesson or the warning, if you will, that if you think yourself a hero, you've got to be willing to take bold steps. Okay, you've got to be willing to fail sometimes, but understand that those failures aren't always going to be tragic failures. And that's where Mr. Hicks is struggling here. He thinks that any step forward is going to mean failure for him. And because of that, he doesn't succeed in anything. It makes me think about Prufrock, right? And that negative self-image and that constant self-doubting that he's so concerned he's going to fail that, of course, he does. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There is also, a lot here about balance and imbalance, the balance of the myth, the imbalance of the reality, the longer stanzas and the shorter stanzas being balanced as well, too long, too short. We have a couple of lines here that are a little bit longer. And again, I think you could talk about these are lines that are significant. By making some lines extend past the others, Field is calling your attention. The big one being this one, right? They would have answered with a shocked, uncomprehending stare. And it goes back to this idea of imbalance, that some people they're just not going to get it. They don't understand it. And I think that you could definitely play on that and then play off of Mr. Hicks' own failure to understand what's going on. So again, y'all, there is a lot here. This is just like a quick intro to some thoughts of mine. We can talk more about this when I get back.